The night was cold, colder than I'd ever felt before. The village was silent, too silent. And then, I heard it, the whistle. A high-pitched, eerie tune that seemed to cut through the air like a knife. It was coming closer, getting louder. I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. And just like that, it stopped. But the silence was worse because it was in that silence I realized I was not alone. I grew up in a small village called Nkwume. It was one of those places where everyone knew everyone, and nothing ever really changed. The days were simple, filled with farming, trading, and storytelling. The nights were calm, with the sounds of crickets and the occasional owl hooting in the distance. Life was peaceful, or at least it used to be. It started a few months ago, just as the harmattan season was beginning. The winds were harsher, the nights colder. And then, the whistle began. At first, it was faint, almost like the wind was playing tricks on us. But then, it became clearer, more distinct. It was a slow, mournful tune that seemed to echo through the entire village. No one knew where it was coming from, but we all heard it. Every night, without fail, just as the moon reached its peak, the whistle would start. The elders said it was the night whistler. A spirit hunter, they claimed, that roamed the land at night, searching for lost souls. They said it had been centuries since the whistler last visited, and that it only returned when the balance between the living and the dead was disturbed. Most of us didn't believe it at first. We thought it was just another one of those old folktales meant to scare children into behaving. But then, people started disappearing. It was the third night after the whistle began when the first person vanished. His name was Emeka, a farmer who lived on the outskirts of the village. He was a big man, strong and kind-hearted. He had a wife, Amaka, and 2 young children. Emeka was the kind of man who never backed down from a challenge, but that night, he didn't stand a chance. Amaka said she woke up to the sound of the whistle. It was louder than usual, almost deafening. She tried to wake Emeka, but he was already up, standing by the window, staring into the darkness. She called his name, but he didn't respond. She said it was like he was in a trance, completely unaware of her presence. And then, without a word, he walked out of the house. Amaka followed him, but as soon as she stepped outside, she saw something that made her stop in her tracks. Emeka's clothes were lying on the ground, perfectly folded, but he was nowhere to be seen. She looked around, calling his name, but there was no answer. All she could hear was the whistle, now fading into the distance. By morning, the entire village knew what had happened. The men formed a search party, combing through the fields and the surrounding forest, but there was no sign of Emeka. It was like he had just vanished into thin air. All that was left of him were his clothes and the faint whistle that still lingered in the air. The elders were convinced it was the night whistler. They said Emeka's soul had been taken because he was lost, spiritually lost. They urged everyone to stay inside after dark, to avoid the whistle at all costs. But the fear had already taken hold of us. We didn't know what to do or who to turn to. And then, it happened again. 3 nights after Emeka disappeared, another villager was taken. This time, it was Chioma, a young girl no more than 15. She was the daughter of one of the elders, and she had been out late, helping her mother with some chores. Her mother said she heard the whistle, and before she could stop her, Chioma walked out of the house, just like Emeka had done. When the villagers found Chioma's clothes lying on the ground, perfectly folded like Emeka's, the panic became real. People started barricading their doors and windows at night, afraid to even look outside. But the whistle kept coming, night after night, growing louder and louder, until it felt like it was right inside our heads. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself that it was just a strange wind or some other natural phenomenon. But deep down, I knew better. I could feel it, the fear creeping into my bones, the sense that something was terribly wrong. And then, it was my turn. It was a night like any other, cold and silent. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the village. I was in bed, trying to sleep, but the whistle wouldn't let me. It started softly, almost like a distant flute, but it grew louder and louder until it was all I could hear. I felt something strange, a pull, like something was calling me. I tried to resist, but my body moved on its own. I got out of bed and walked to the window. The whistle was deafening now, but I couldn't stop myself. I opened the door and stepped outside. The night air was cold, biting against my skin, but I didn't feel it. All I could think about was the whistle. I walked towards the sound, my feet moving without my command. The village was empty, everyone was inside, hiding from the night whistler. But I kept walking. I didn't know where I was going, but my legs carried me through the village, past the houses, and into the fields. The whistle was all around me now, wrapping around me like a shroud. I could feel it vibrating in my chest, echoing in my mind. And then, I saw him. He was standing at the edge of the forest, a tall, shadowy figure with no face, just a dark, empty void where his features should have been. He was holding something, a flute, or maybe a whistle. I couldn't tell. But he was playing it, and the sound was the same haunting tune that had been tormenting us for weeks. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. My body was frozen, trapped in place by the sound. The whistler didn't move, but I could feel his gaze on me, feel the coldness of his presence. And then, he stopped playing. The silence was deafening. It was like the world had stopped turning, like everything was holding its breath. And in that silence, I knew what was coming. The whistler took a step forward, and I felt a cold hand close around my heart. It was like my soul was being pulled from my body, like I was being dragged into the darkness with him. I could see the other villagers now, the ones who had disappeared. They were standing behind him, their eyes empty, their bodies pale and lifeless. I was going to join them. I knew it. I could feel my soul slipping away, my vision fading. But then, something strange happened. The whistle returned, but this time, it was different. It wasn't coming from the whistler, it was coming from the village. It was the same tune, but it was stronger, louder, filled with power. The whistler stopped, his head tilting as if he was listening. And then, the whistle from the village grew louder, overpowering the one from the whistler. It was like a battle of sound, a fight for control. The whistler's grip on me loosened, and I could move again. I didn't know what was happening, but I ran. I ran as fast as I could, back towards the village, back towards the source of the new whistle. As I got closer, I saw a figure standing in the center of the village square, holding a flute. It was old Chief Namdi, the oldest man in the village and the keeper of our traditions. He was playing the flute with all his strength, his eyes closed, his face twisted in concentration. The sound was powerful, ancient, filled with the wisdom of generations. It was a sound that commanded respect, a sound that could not be ignored. The whistler's tune was fading now, growing weaker and weaker, until it was just a whisper in the wind. And then, it was gone. Chief Namdi stopped playing, his hands trembling as he lowered the flute. The village was silent once more, but it was a different kind of silence. It was peaceful, calm, like the storm had finally passed. I collapsed to the ground, my body shaking with relief. The whistler was gone, defeated by the power of our ancestors, by the strength of our traditions. But the memory of that night would stay with me forever. We never saw the whistler again after that night. The villagers returned to their normal lives, but the fear never truly left us. We knew that the balance between the living and the dead was fragile, and that it could be disturbed at any time. But we also knew that as long as we held on to our traditions, as long as we remembered the wisdom of our ancestors, we would be safe. The whistle was a warning, a reminder that the spirit world was closer than we thought. And that we should never forget the old ways, for they were our only protection against the darkness that lurked just beyond the edge of the light. And so, we continued to live our lives, always with one ear open for the sound of the whistle, and with a heart full of respect for the spirits that watched over us. But I will never forget that night, the night I came face to face with the night whistler. The night I almost lost my soul to the darkness. The night our ancestors saved us from the clutches of the spirit hunter. And even now, years later, I sometimes hear a faint whistle in the wind, and I wonder if the whistler is still out there, waiting for the balance to tip once more. But as long as we remember who we are, I know we will be ready for him when he comes again.